A programming note before we begin. Today's conversation with Tony Traina of Hodinkee takes a look at the current health of and sentiment toward the watch industry. We look at how brands, retailers, and watch media contribute to the current state of the industry and what they can do to improve things. We'd also like to hear from you on these topics. In particular, we've created a short survey at collectivehorology.com/survey to get your thoughts on watch collecting, what you're into, what needs to change, and how you see the future. And to thank you for completing the survey, we're offering a very special gift. More details at collectivehorology.com/survey. Thanks for making the time. And now, on with the show.
This is Openwork, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Rapkin, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Gabe Reilly, co-founder of Collective.
Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including Singer Reimagined, Fears, Speak Marine, and more. To learn more about us and check out our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com. Today on the podcast, we are joined by Tony Traina, editor at Hodinkee. Tony forged his own way in the watch industry by starting the email newsletter Rescapement while he was still working as a corporate lawyer in Chicago. In 2022, Tony made the decision to change careers, something both Gabe and I understand both the excitement and, well, the terror of, and left his legal job to join the ranks of the Hodinkee editorial staff. Tony's been a friend of Collective over the years, and we always enjoy seeing him at events around the world, but it is his most recent article in Rescapement which provoked us to reach out to him and invite him on Openwork.
In that article, our reports of the watch industry's collapse greatly exaggerated. Tony tackles probably the biggest elephant in the room right now. And Openwork seemed like the perfect place not only to discuss his thoughts, but also ask ourselves, what exactly is going on here, and what is the way out of this? So with that, Tony, welcome to Openwork.
Well, guys, Asher, Gabe, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's a pleasure. It's an honor. I've known you guys for a while, and happy to be joining you all to talk about the business of watches, I guess. I don't know what we'll get into, but hopefully it'll be exciting here.
The business of watches.
Yeah, the business of watches. I think it's interesting. Asher, what is this now? Episode 14, I think this is?
Yep, episode 14.
Episode 14 on a podcast really devoted to the inner workings of the watch industry. And the one thing we really haven't spoken about this year, except maybe in episode 1, but we really haven't tackled it as a dedicated topic, is probably the biggest meme right now in the watch industry, and maybe in particular among watch collectors, which is this notion that, you know, the sky is falling, the watch industry is collapsing. And I think your article inspired us to take it on because I think, you know, you really, from our perspective, hit the nail on the head. And I think the general gist of your article was that, you know, sales may be down, or certainly maybe not growing, and we'll talk about some data in a second. But everyone is proclaiming the demise of the watch industry, and in doing so, they might be a bit over their skis, or that might not be quite right. Was that sort of the gist of your article?
Yeah, I think so. To be clear, I kind of just riffed on this on a Sunday night, as I do when I send out sort of a weekly update or a weekly newsletter, just on what I've been up to at Hodinkee. And I just had seen, as you're mentioning, I'd seen 3 or 4 or 5 articles about how the watch industry is collapsing, the fashion or luxury industry is collapsing. And I think I mentioned this. You could probably say this more broadly or more specifically if you wanted to. You know, if you want to get political, democracy is collapsing depending on who you ask. If you want to get specific, people are worried about the vintage Rolex market and, you know, the vintage GMT market, whatever it is. Like, it seems as though anywhere you look, no matter how high or how low you sort of ask the question, people are just concerned about these types of things. And it's just like, so it's exhausting on some level to me. I spend all day thinking about this, and I see all kinds of corners of the market that are exciting still, that seem to be thriving, but the sort of the hyperbolic nature of claiming that an industry is collapsing usually kind of drives engagement, I think. So I think that's probably some of it. Some of it is real, to be clear, but some of it is probably a little bit getting over their skis, as you kind of said it, Gabe. But that's kind of just was the entire impetus for me to just write this article. Is I had seen this sort of narrative just developing everywhere you looked, and it kind of was driving me crazy, man.
Yeah, well, then the narrative is real. The meme is real. It's definitely out there, and I think for us that article in your newsletter really put a finger on it. And so it inspired us in preparation for today's conversation to really actually dig into some data about this and actually get a sense of where the watch industry really is in terms of sales, in terms of growth, in terms of its overall health. And we looked at a few sources to do that. So we looked at the Federation of the Swiss Watch Industry's monthly export data. We looked at Watches of Switzerland's quarterly and annual earnings reports. This is one of the few, if not the only, really large publicly traded watch retailer. So it's a good way to get a sense of what's happening in retail channels. And we looked at Morgan Stanley's 2023 Swiss Watch Industry report. And those are kind of like the big three when it comes to having a data-driven sense of what's really happening within the new watch market. There are also great sources for the secondary watch market, watch charts being one of them. But what we wanted to do here is really focus on new watches, because I think that's what we generally mean when we talk about the watch industry. I'm going to link in the show notes to all of these data sources so that, and they're all publicly available. So if people want to go through them and look at the particulars, I think it's really kind of interesting to do so. But I'll share with you guys, and I think this will help inform our conversation, kind of the key takeaways I got from combing through this data and these reports. So first of all, exports. So the number of watches and the value of watches in particular shipped out of Switzerland last year grew to their largest number ever. So about 27 billion Swiss francs. That's a record-breaking value in terms of export of watches. So in some sense, coming out of 2023, the watch industry has never been bigger. Now, of course, one thing to note there is that those export values represent really wholesale, right? So what is being sold into the retail channel, not necessarily what is being purchased by customers. But I think it's still an important barometer. The industry itself was growing and realized its biggest year ever, even on the back of years like 2021 and 2022. So we have that overall export data, but within the export data, there's really this tale of two halves. And actually, there was an interesting article in Revolution looking at this report and kind of extracting some of these insights. So we'll share that article from Revolution. But really what you see is brands like AP, Rolex, Patek Philippe, and Richard Mille are gaining share. So relative to the overall pie of the Swiss watch industry, these brands are growing, they're picking up sales, they're growing their exports, whereas brands owned by LVMH, Richemont, and the Swatch Group are losing share, and in some cases losing share dramatically. So when we talk about the watch industry in aggregate, it's growing, but that doesn't mean that the whole industry is doing well, that everyone is growing sales. Obviously, there are differences among brands, and I think as the data in the report really shows, there are some stark differences. So when we say the industry is doing well and growing, fair enough, but it's important to look within the data and see at a brand level what's happening. And by the way, some brands within Richemont are growing and doing well, and some brands are losing share quite dramatically. Now, what's interesting is when you dig into the export data month by month for 2024. So we were talking about 2023 in the aggregate. When we look at 2024, it's a bit of a different picture. Sales or exports have been slowing this year, and in particular, they have slowed every month through May. So exports coming out of Switzerland are slowing, and if that trend keeps up, we will have, relative to export, a down year in the Swiss watch industry. So I think what we talked about a second ago, which is the data we're talking about here represents wholesale into the retail channel, not to customers, and there may be some lag. Well, we're starting to potentially see that lag show up in the data. Now, speaking of what's happening at retail, Watches of Switzerland's annual report, I think, is really interesting to look at. Essentially, they were flat. Now, on a constant currency basis, meaning if you adjust for currency fluctuation, which is something we've talked about quite a bit on the pod here, their sales were actually up a couple of percentage points for the year. So their sales aren't necessarily slipping. Their sales aren't going down. They're holding about flat and where they were. So I think what we're seeing overall here is a cooling in the growth of the watch industry, but it's still growing. And it's still certainly larger than it was in 2019 before the mania of COVID and the buying frenzy that set off. And within that context are brands that are struggling for sure. So when you see signs of brands that are struggling, that is real. There are, however, just as many brands that are doing well, if not exceptionally well. But really, that's the nature of any kind of mature and diverse industry. But all of this to say, let's say we can agree the watch industry isn't necessarily dead. Let's say its growth is slowing, but it is still growing, and it's still bigger in some sense than it's ever been. Why do you guys think it is that we hear from so many pundits, from so many people in the community, that the industry is dead? Because the data would suggest otherwise, yet there's this strong feeling that the sky is falling and that everything is shit.
I think a couple of things, Gabe, that you so eloquently laid out with the data. A couple of things. First of all, to add a little bit of just anecdata, if you will, to the actual hard facts. I don't know about you guys, but I've heard just of ADs and SAs talking about having to sit on more Rolex inventory and more of it kind of being pushed to the actual stores. And then from customers, more of it actually being available, right? So I think sales channels are just being filled up, and that doesn't necessarily show up in the export data, right? It just shows up as stuff that's getting exported, and maybe it's not necessarily reaching the end consumer. It's sitting in inventory. And I think a lot of people, enthusiast collectors like us that are closer to the end of the value chain, feel that and see that in a very real way when they see a new black and gray GMT being offered in a group chat or whatever, saying, hey, the AD just offered this, or whatever it is, right? So I think there's some of that. I also think one of the big trends that you kind of mentioned that the data of the Morgan Stanley report shows, first of all, kind of taking that thing with a grain of salt. I think it's probably directionally correct or relatively correct, but, kind of query how they even get data from some of the most secretive Swiss companies. But that's a story for another day, I think. But I think directionally, it does sort of get to the point that the industry is really consolidating in a few big brands. You mentioned them, right? It's the ones that we know: Rolex, Cartier, Patek, AP, RM. And I can't remember exactly what the statistics are, but I think they said something like the top 4 or 5 brands are half of the Swiss watch industry at this point. And then if you zoom out even more, I think it was 12 or 13 or 75% of the market. And I think that's just going to continue. I think that trend is going to continue. I mean, Rolex on its own is 30% of the market and growing. And I think it's just going to continue to consolidate in a few big brands. And I also think, look, you guys at Collective know this as well as anyone. There is a flourishing of small brands that are doing things differently. They have a lower cost structure, and they're figuring out how to survive in a world. But I think what is happening is a lot of that big fat middle is just kind of lost or figuring out how to survive in this world. If you look at the Morgan Stanley table, for example, maybe that's brands ranked like 20 to 60 or whatever it is. I don't know. You can kind of look at some of those brands, and like you and I could both look at some of them and be like, how much have I really thought about that brand? And I'm in this pretty deep. I spend all day thinking about this brand, and I rarely cover them. You guys don't think about collaborating with them probably because their story has just been lost in the past, since Apple Watch, at least since the quartz crisis, maybe, I don't know, depending on the brand, depending on the story. But I think that's also what's happening. I think some of that is the way in which just probably technology and social media changes the way in which we consume things. Some of it is younger guys like us probably don't have the taste that a generation ago had. And I think there's a number of things that are coming together to just create this feeling of angst in the industry overall.
There has to be, whether it's in business, in terms of a relationship between a client and a vendor, an AD, and a collector, whatever, or an employee in a company, there has to be some degree of symbiosis in order for things to functionally work, right? And Gabe will remember this because I used to talk about in my former life when a company decided that they wanted things to be a certain way, even if it didn't align with the reality of the employees or the market. That classic phrase of the beatings will continue until morale improves totally applies. And I think that's true a little bit in the scenario that we're in right now. And that's because we have sort of two tensions that are in direct opposition, right? We have an industry which for whatever reason, believed that the trajectory, as so many industries, in fairness to the luxury industry, as so many industries did believe that the trajectory would continue on the aggressive up and to the right, and that the outlandish spending of both the companies and consumers would continue. And then you have that in direct opposition with the way a consumer clearly feels at the moment, whether or not that's connected to economic reality or not, which is, I feel like I'm being taken advantage of. And one thing that I've seen, which I think is true, and then I want to pivot into something that you said about fashion, Tony, in your article. One thing that I think is true here is you have a lot of clients who are, I think, putting some negativity out into the world because it is a form of reclaiming control in some sense. Because the relationship that has existed for the last 10 years or so in the watch industry has really been, industry is very much like in control. They reveal things, you get them, and if you're lucky to get them, you are elevated from a status standpoint as a collector or what have you, right? But that's obviously changing now as availability comes in. And I think we're at a point where, until we can get back into a form of symbiosis where it still feels like a special experience to be able to do something like buy a watch again and feel like the value that you're extracting from it is there, I think we're going to find that we're in opposition. And we'll talk a little bit about what we can do to get out of this, but that's certainly part of it. Tony, in your article, you quoted something, I believe, was it from the Business of Fashion? And I just want to read it because I think it encapsulates a lot of what you were just talking about. Quote, "Now the approach is more formulaic, akin to selling luxury merch in an overpriced supermarket. This is a world where it is easier to copy the shape of a box bag that is working at another brand than it is to come up with a unique shape of your own. Customers have cottoned onto this and would rather spend their money on one-of-a-kind experiences or hard-to-find vintage pieces than have the same thing as everyone else." And you draw a point here that is quite different, right? I mean, you say, and I'm quoting you now, during the run-up, everyone wanted a Nautilus, a Daytona, or a Vuitton Neverfull because it seemed like everyone else had one. Ironically, it is the same ubiquity now that has made the tide turn against these accessible luxuries. Instead, consumers want something that feels unique. And anecdotally, like, we see that, like, there's been an uptick in sales, for example, in Garrick, which is a bespoke only watch brand that we carry. And that is something that we do see. So I think, and again, that's anecdotal, but it is something that I am seeing. Although Garrick makes 100 watches a year. So that's not really like a scalable thing.
Well, that's kind of the point, though, right? Like, people are looking for that type of stuff now. Garrick, the story is interesting, right? And you guys have done a great job sort of helping to tell that in America. But that's kind of the actual point, So I'm glad you actually brought them up. But I don't know. I mean, first of all, I follow Business of Fashion because maybe you guys have some perspective on this as well before we get into the actual substance of the matter. But I think I underestimated these, sitting here in America, in the States, in Chicago for me, I underestimated the extent to which I was joining like a luxury business and a Swiss luxury business at that when I decided to join the quote unquote watch industry. And sometimes I'm sort of reminded of that, especially when you go to something like Watches and Wonders and everyone's wearing their navy blue suits and crisp white shirts and stuff. It's not the most exciting part of the industry for me. I love talking to enthusiasts and people like you and hanging out with people in Chicago or LA or wherever it is. But the business of watches is still a very serious and luxurious thing, which I had underestimated, I suppose, at the beginning.
It's an interesting, and look, I understand that like a lot of enthusiasts in particular like balk at the analogy to fashion, but I would argue it's a really good parallel, just like any other sort of like niche luxury is. Like cycling is a conversation, like high-end bikes came up recently in a conversation we had as another example of this. Certainly fashion, menswear, et cetera, is another parallel for this. There are lots of them, but this still tells me, and the insight that you're bringing up does, I think, go back to the earlier point that we were talking about the expectations of a business and the expectations of the consumer have really slid out of alignment, and figuring out how to move them a little bit back into alignment is key. So let's talk a little bit about creativity, because that's a lever that we've sort of touched on here, but I'd like to go deeper into it, right? We talk about like, okay, so Rolex came out with a different bezel on their GMT, and that was their novelty. Now, in fairness, that's the Rolex playbook, right? Which is like small changes every year, and that's it. If you're a Rolex person, like, that's great. If you're somebody else, then maybe you don't care, and that's fine. But so I think Rolex may not be a good example of that. Let's look at, just Watches and Wonders writ large. which I think we can all say was definitely a lot of brands, with a couple of outliers here or there, playing it really safe this year in their releases, which I have to say in the moment I thought was actually a really strong idea. And I may have been wrong about that, because I think if we are operating on the assumption that the industry and the potential consumer is out of alignment, and one potential lever might be for a little bit more experimentation to bring back some enthusiasm and excitement and positivity, then that was a missed opportunity at that show. I understand. So I'm curious. Let's talk a little bit about that, because I see both sides of why brands don't like taking creative risks. We've talked about this in the past on some pods, but I'd also like to get your thought on it, because you talk to everybody, brand and consumer. And what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I think I wrote about this in sort of some Watches and Wonders, post Watches and Wonders dispatch somewhere, kind of exactly what you said, the conventional line of wisdom at the actual Watches and Wonders show. For those who aren't listening, that's where all the big brands, Rolex and Patek and whoever else are. It seemed as though they were super conservative, not releasing a ton of new stuff. And at first blush, that seems to make sense, right? The Rolex CEO even gave an interview beforehand that said something like, batten down the hatches, guys. It's going to be a rough couple of years. But the more you got quite literally outside of Watches and Wonders, a lot of the smaller brands display elsewhere in the city where it doesn't cost $1 million to put up a booth or whatever it is. There seemed to be more risk-taking and creativity from smaller brands, independent brands, micro brands, brands that you guys deal with. That was exciting to me. I think I mentioned some of the watches that I was excited about came from random meetings that weren't even at an official show. So I met Sylvain Berneron and saw his watch at some random bar. Excited about some of the stuff guys like Furlan Mari and other things like that at the lower end are doing. But those are far away from the bowels of Watches and Wonders.
And represent a very, very small component of the industry revenue-wise.
Totally. But it crystallized something in my mind, was like, hey, if this is what I'm getting excited about, maybe I'm in it too deep, to be fair. But if this is what I'm getting excited about, it made me sort of question that conventional wisdom of like, if things really are if we are going sort of through a cyclical downturn here, maybe brands should be open to taking more risks than they are. The big brands at Watches and Wonders and things like that. But the reality is, watches are just such big business nowadays. There's so much on the line. And I think their want to sort of do anything outside of what they know will work well. I mean, you mentioned Rolex, but it's the same thing with all of these other brands that know generally what works kind of well. And, you know how you can hit, to use the sports analogy, how to hit a double if you're Rolex or IWC or whoever else. And you might do that instead of, swinging for the fences or whatever it is. And that's fine. I mean, look, maybe you get on base and that's how you win a World Series, but we like dingers too, right, guys?
Well, there's also, exactly. Well, there's also like the other caveat here, which is, I think, always important to remember. Every one of us, whether it's, guys like us that are, authorized dealers, guys like you that spend your entire life writing about and thinking about watches, and the guys who interact with us because we sell niche product and read Hodinkee, which is a niche, niche topic, generally speaking, writ large. We're talking about like 5 to 10%, I suspect, if not less, of the entire like watch buying market. The majority of guys who walk into, or gals who walk in to buy a Rolex, I suspect, are not plugged in as aggressively into the reality of the watch market as we are. So we're definitely like we're looking at this through the lens of the people who are most passionate about the product. Because I'm fairly confident that the billions of Swiss francs in exports, like a component of that are going to enthusiasts. Most of that are going to like someone who just, got married and bought a Rolex. You know what I mean? And they don't like, it doesn't matter to them. And maybe they liked a gray black bezel and then they'll never think about Rolex ever again.
Yeah. There's this notion in the broader economy that gained traction maybe a couple of years ago, which was this idea of a vibe session. And it was coined by a woman, I think her name is Kyla Scanlon, and she wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about this. And basically what she was saying was like, look, the economy, if you look at the data, is quite strong. Employment is quite strong. People's personal balance sheets are quite strong, so on and so forth. But there's this feeling, and it's still out there. There's this feeling, in the United States at least, that everything is terrible. The economy is horrible. The sky is falling. And that's the vibe session. There's this feeling, there's this malaise, even though the data suggests otherwise. That feeling, that malaise, is a very real and a palpable thing. And I think that's kind of what's going on here, because Asher, your point is a really good one. The watch enthusiast community is a wonderful thing, but it's a very small subset of the overall watch industry. But there's this feeling, and we hear it all the time in WhatsApp groups we're in from our customers directly, that there's this feeling that, the watch industry is really suffering and is in a bad place. And, the numbers would suggest, and our own business would suggest, that that's just not true. But that doesn't mean those feelings aren't legitimate and that they don't hold value and that they aren't pointing to something that's a real challenge. And so when brands do things like stop taking risk, it acts as this anecdotal data point, right, to an enthusiast, which is, aha, see, this is another sign that the industry is failing. Brands have decided to hit doubles or whatever instead of home runs. And I think this was a moment in time, frankly, that if I think back to 2020 and 2021, I think this was a moment in time that a lot of people were waiting for. I remember reading on forums and in Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups and things like that people couldn't wait. Collectors, enthusiasts couldn't wait for a downturn in the market, because finally they'd be able to get the speculators would be out of the market. Finally, they'd be able to get the thing that they wanted that they couldn't have, or finally, the retailer who had been holding them at arm's length and not giving them what they want would suffer. And I think, as they read the tea leaves, and Tony, you're right, watches are more available, brands are taking less risk, sales at Watches of Switzerland might be just fine, but their stock went down 30%. These are all little anecdotal pieces of data that people have latched onto to say, that moment I was waiting for and hoping for is here now, whether it really is or isn't. And that's not to say that these folks are wrong and shouldn't feel the way they feel. Absolutely, they should. But I think it's important to distinguish sort of like the vibe session from the data of what's actually happening in the watch collecting community. And I think there is there is a sense of people feeling like they've been burned or they've been had, or that the hobby isn't somehow as fun to them as it was before. And those are important feelings to acknowledge. These are things I see in the comments, for instance, on Hodinkee. These are things we hear from customers.
I think it's actually a really interesting thing, right? Because when we look at these moments where someone is feeling so frustrated that they want to express themselves that negatively and publicly, there's like a couple of thoughts that I don't know if these are right, but they are things that I think are important to consider. The first is that person salvageable? And I think this is like an important and broad question to ask. Like, if someone is so angry that they're going to get into a fight with strangers on the internet about a product that they may never have even wanted to buy in the first place, they just want to fight about it. Is that the person that the industry really should be spending the time to try and pull back in? Or, and by the way, I'm not absolving the industry or anybody here of responsibility in maybe, bringing someone to the dark side. Like, I'm not, like whatever happened. But there's a certain point where I'm like, is that the person we want to work on? Or do we need to take a breath and realize, like, as an industry, maybe we alienated a lot of people and we need to make a decision moving forward about how not to do that. Now, here comes the inherent tension of luxury goods. Luxury goods at their core, and I think this is broadly true, is about not just an aspirational purchase, but an exclusive purchase. And exclusivity appears to be one of the biggest pain points that has caused so much negativity towards the industry, right? I want a Daytona. I'm not going to get one because I'm not special enough and I haven't spent enough and my AD doesn't like me enough and blah, 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 blah. But if the AD called them up and was like, hey, I have a Daytona available for 16,000, whatever, it's available right now. Oh, well, I wanted the black dial one. Oh, I have a black dial one. Actually, I'm not ready to buy one because it's not exclusive. It's not special. You didn't have to fight to get it. and it's no longer a signal to people about what it is. And I realize that there's probably like I probably just raised some heart rates in saying that, but like, let's be honest with each other. Like, that's part of it. Part of it is knowing that you have something that feels to you as really special, or a get, or a win. And I'm not entirely sure, although I think we can move into this part of the conversation in a moment, like if that's a solvable tension, because that's an inherent truth of luxury, right? That's my opinion, but I'm curious. Like, you can't make things more available and expect them to still feel exclusive. But if you're a consumer, if you want things to be more available, then you have to accept that they're not as exclusive. There's a reason why a Tory Burch bag is not as sexy, I suspect, as an Hermes Birkin. And if Hermes Birkins were available off the shelf every day, they wouldn't feel as special. And this is an inherent tension.
Yeah, of course, the sort of fundamental tension between fashion, or luxury fashion at least, is wanting to fit in, or signaling that you're part of some group, but also wanting to sort of stand out. And those kind of go back and forth, as you're kind of talking about. And to go back to that Business of Fashion quote, there was something about people, consumers, wanting or looking more for unique experiences, vintage pieces, things like that, because it feels as though, especially during the run-up, people were going after the same few watches, and we went too far in that direction of wanting to fit in, and now we're back in the wanting to stand out part of thing. And a lot of times we're doing that in subtle ways, looking for unique vintage pieces, or just going on experiences and not even posting about whatever it is. But, there's kind of this idea that the right amount of Rolex Daytona's example to produce would be, N-1, where N is the number of Daytonas that are desired in the world. And we got too close to like N- thousands or hundreds of thousands, right? And I think we're correcting a little bit, but there's still some ways to go in Daytona land, at least. I think things like Submariners are more available nowadays. But Daytona land might always be the one that you can't get, but some of these other watches are much more gettable than they were a couple of years ago. I mean, I don't want to live in a world where it's hard to get a Submariner. Like, that just doesn't feel right. That's, look, it's a luxury Rolex watch, but it's a Submariner. Come on, anyone should be able to walk in and get some of these watches with at least, it might take a couple of days or something, right? Maybe you can't buy it off the shelf. They've got to check your social media and make sure you're not flipping the thing or whatever it is. But beyond that, some of these watches should be gettable. But this is the fundamental tension of luxury. And there's just the way in which people have become so aware of these things. Demand just has gotten so high over the past few years. And we read about Rolex creating new plants and manufacturing facilities in Switzerland to try to catch up with production. But these things aren't coming online for a while, so it's going to take some time. But surely it will balance out over time, as you're kind of hinting at.
I think by this point, everyone, whether it's in this conversation or just being a participant in the vibe session, I love that, by the way, Gabe, we all know the problem, or the feeling at least. So I want to talk a little bit about what some of the solutions might be. And obviously, these are going to be just some opinions from us, but I think it's important. I want to break it down by cohort, because I think in order for things to work, there has to be responsibility and changes and honesty from the industry, from retailers, and from collectors, because it's a symbiotic thing. Like, we all have, like, it all has to work together for it to really work. And consumers cannot turn a blind eye to some realities that they may not like. And the industry needs to give on some things, I would imagine, that they don't like. And there are components in there, and ADs too, of course. I don't want to exclude myself from this, but like, there are elements here that all have to give in order for this to be sustainable. Who do we want to put in the spotlight first here? I suppose maybe ADs, since we are one.
Sure. Take the first bullet, Asher.
Yeah. What are you guys doing wrong?
I mean, look, the way we've operated as an AD, and this could just be pure naivete, has been, I mean, most of what we do is pure naivete, but we try to operate as an authorized dealer the way we wished authorized dealers acted when we were simply just watch collectors and watch enthusiasts.
But in fairness, we got to set our own rules because we weren't a family jeweler. We didn't have 75 years of history. We weren't already in bed with holding companies that expected us to pay them lots of money every month. So in fairness to our colleagues, like we got to set our own rules in some ways, in ways that other folks would not have been able to.
Okay, well that's interesting, because I don't want to absolve the dealers of bad behavior, because there's certainly, we've all experienced it, terrible ways dealers have treated people. And again, part of the reason why we do this is because we felt like there were many wrongs to be corrected. I was going to say wrongs to be written, but that wouldn't make sense. There are many wrongs to be righted as an authorized dealer, and to essentially treat people the way we would want to be. No, I'm not. No, but I think we saw enough challenges in the ways that dealers treated enthusiasts that we felt like, man, we could really do well in a business operating as an AD that was sort of by enthusiasts for enthusiasts. But look, your point around a lot of legacy retailers are in a tough position where they have brands who may have desirable products, right? Who tell them, yes, if you'd like these desirable products from us, you also need to accept a truckload of undesirable products for us. Therefore, what is that legacy retailer left to do aside from trying to do things like bundling watches, which infuriates people, or keeping watches that are desirable in the safe, even if they have plenty of them, to create an illusion that they're hard to get and games must be played. So I think there are structures in the way a lot of the legacy retail business works that are really challenging for enthusiasts and people who just love watches and want to be able to go in and get a Submariner. And I'm not so sure that that's the retailer's fault, to be honest. I think the brands, one meme I've heard a lot from collectors over the years is, let's take a Rolex dealer, right? And I'm just making this up. There are many wonderful Rolex dealers, but I've heard this meme many times. Man, if only Rolex knew the way this dealer treated me, they would probably be in serious trouble with the brand. And that's referring to things like withholding watches or bundling watches or things like that. However, it's Rolex who often sets the business practices and the terms by which those dealers must play. So in other words, why does the Rolex dealer hypothetically have to bundle a watch? Well, because for every Submariner, Tony, they receive, they get a truckload of two-tone date justs that they need to do something with, right? And so it's actually the brand in some ways that's incentivizing a lot of these bad behaviors. So Asher, I'm not sure I really answered your question, but I do think it's important to peel back the curtain here and recognize that some of the bad business practices that dealers are very much guilty of are incentivized and created structurally by the brands.
You're absolutely right. Like big brand, and we can talk about this in a second on the industry side, like there is pressure that goes to dealers, that pressure is exerted onto clients, and like liability is pushed downhill. That's true. The flip side of that, though, is there are also things that I think some consumers that are repeat watch buyers, right? So in other words, enthusiasts and collectors want from brands that brands don't want to talk about and turn a blind eye to, right? So I'll give you an example. Let's talk about Breguet for a moment. Breguet is, I love Breguet. I've owned 6, maybe 7 Breguets over the course of my collecting. I'm probably like the one guy who likes the Marine. Like I love the Marine. But the thing is, Breguet lives in the world they want to live in, not the world that they actually live in. And what I mean by that is nobody pays that for a Breguet. Nobody. So who's getting punished for that? It's the dealer, because the dealer is dropping their pants in order to sell a Breguet at what people are willing to pay for it. And they're just keeping their head above water, I suspect, because I know the economics of what it is to retail watches. So they're just barely keeping their head above water to like just move through the inventory that they're being sold. And then consumers are incredibly frustrated because they're buying something at what is, from an absolute value standpoint, quite expensive, but is diminished dramatically because Swatch doesn't care enough to actually take care of that brand in a meaningful way and live in a reality that is functional.
By the way, if you're asking yourself, well, why does the dealer even carry Breguet in the first place if they have to discount a watch so heavily to sell it to the consumer? It's because Breguet is part of Swatch Group. And if they want to have Omega or Blancpain or something else, well then, yeah, we'd love to give you this Omega franchise, but where's the space in the store for Breguet, right? So this, again, this is another form of bundling and bad incentives that the industry creates.
Yeah. So as a side note, just so everyone does know, like dealers get bundled too, by the way, except if you thought it really stunk to get some earrings bundled in, imagine having $1 million of wholesale Breguet bundled into your life. So in fairness to authorized dealers, like, you know, it's a cycle of abuse here, guys, and it's getting pushed down. So from an AD standpoint, I think one thing that ADs, there's like one big lesson that I'm taking, right? And one is if we all need to live in a shared reality. And if we're going to live in a shared reality, that means ADs are very much being pulled in two directions. There's the reality of the consumer that they're ultimately the primary point of contact for, and who they need to take care of, and who they build relationships with, and who they need to sell product to at a rate that is commensurate with what people are willing to pay for it. I'm not talking about discounting. I'm just saying there are products that we sell, for example, where nobody ever says, what can you do for me on this? Because they're like, yeah, that's what that should cost. And then there are products that we sell where people are like, I'd love to buy that, but like, you got to work with me on this. And it's up to us as an authorized dealer to determine if that is a reasonable decision or not. But that ultimately is our responsibility and affects our bottom line. And that's why I think sometimes dealers are so grumpy about this kind of thing. So dealers need to and my solution point on this is that dealers need to be more explicit and draw the line on shared liability with the brands, especially the larger brands. The indies, it's a little harder because liability is more intense. But with bigger brands, just say, you know what? No. And the thing is, that's going to hurt, right? Because we know what'll happen. Swatch will say, all right, get bent. No Omega for you. But the thing is, if that happens in aggregate, then there's a pivot point. So I realize it's easy for me to say that because I don't feed my family by selling Omega or being in business with Swatch. And I can say these sorts of things because almost certainly never going to be in business with Swatch. And most of the things I've said about Swatch publicly probably ensure that. But it's true. It's because their expectations of a dealer are so out of reality relative to a market, and that pressure point needs to be relieved.
We started this conversation talking about the consolidation of brands. And the reality is the exact same thing is happening on the AD side, and that's a natural reaction to the big brands getting bigger. You, as a retailer, you need to get bigger or die. You need to have a contract with Rolex or you're going to die. Because the other thing that's happening on the brand side is they're saying, well, screw you, retailers. Like, we'll just go direct. We don't need it. We don't need to be in a
except
multi-brand
consumers
AD.
don't want that, and that's something that we hear regularly, which is like most people don't want single brand boutiques except for Rolex.
I'm looking at the table, this Morgan Stanley table now, though. For example, Cartier 40% wholesale, AP basically no wholesale, Patek a lot of wholesale still, RM no wholesale, and then from there more of the brands are wholesale and third party retailers. But a lot of these brands at the top are looking more and more to go direct. And that's good for them in the top 10 or so. But after that, as we're talking about, it gets really hard. And these brands do need these retailers to help with the sales process.
You're touching on a really, really critical point, which is this goes back to what I'm saying about the shared reality, right? Of course, brands want to have direct relationships with their consumers from a financial standpoint, but the expectation structure there is out of whack. And we hear this regularly. Like, let's talk about AP for a second. How many APs are you supposed to buy? Like, right? Like, that's the thing, or Longa or whatever. It's like, realistically speaking, these things are absolutely very expensive. So if I want an AP, like, how many APs do I have to buy before I get the one that I want? And that is just so grossly like misaligned with any sort of financial reality for the majority of people. So even though a brand may look at that from a financial standpoint and say, what, $20 can buy many peanuts. Like, I get that. But at the same time, like, a consumer doesn't want that. And we hear regularly that the mono brand boutique experience is, with a few exceptions, terrible.
It works for probably about 10 brands. Longa is the big one, right? Who has almost 100% transition at this point to single brand direct to consumer boutiques. And I went out to their San Francisco opening recently, And, I asked Wilhelm Schmidt, the CEO, I said, what do you say to these multi-brand retailers? Like, you're kind of leaving them. What do you say? Or what do you think is the business? I didn't say that. I said, what do you think is the future for these multi-brand retailers? And he said, he kind of looked at me certainly. He's like, any business that drives value to the consumer will continue to exist, which, it sounds simple, but is very true. And the reality is for Lange, these retailers were not really doing anything for them. Lange knows their customer quite well, and they sell 5,000 watches a year, and they can sell 5,000 watches a year without any issue for the most part. I think we could probably quibble at the edges of that statement, but they are one of a handful of brands. Breguet, good luck selling a Breguet, that's one of those brands in that 20 to 50 range or whatever it is that I talked about that, like, what are we doing here, guys? What are we doing with $140,000 tourbillon that sells for $40,000 on the secondary or whatever else it is,
It's because they don't, like, as I mentioned earlier, like that brand lives in the reality they want to live in, which is forced sale to third-party dealers versus a reality of actual value based on brand development in the market.
It's true. And part of the appeal of having a retailer or a third-party network is you don't have to experience the hit of that, right? If you're Breguet, you pass through the $140,000 tourbillon and you're done and dusted with it. Like, oh, thank God, don't have to worry about that watch anymore. It's their problem now. And, that can be how you think about it. And that's, getting to your point about shared risk or whatever, it's good for them when they're passing off the entire risk. But maybe to your point, there needs to be more of an acknowledgement about the way in which things are and how difficult it is to sell Breguet or whatever other watch it's on, or whatever other watch we're talking about. Sorry to Breguet for catching so many strays.
Thank you to our sponsor, Swatch Group.
I love so many of their like 80s and 90s watches, for the record.
So one component that we haven't really talked about, but I do think is an important element of the industry here is media. And look, Tony, you're part of probably the biggest and most well-known and most established media outlet related to watches that's out there. And, we talked to Stephen Pulverant early on in Openwork about some of the realities of being a watch journalist, some of the good stuff, some of the rough stuff. And in industry predictions, one of the things that we pointed out early on was that we believe in 2024 that and beyond that watch media is going to take on new forms and evolve. It may become more decentralized, etc. But this is me on the outside. Like, I've been a collector, I've been a AD, I've never been a watch journalist. So, Tony, as we talk about like how we move this industry forward, like what is watch journalism's role in that?
I think, first of all, count your lucky stars, Asher. No, just kidding. Look, I've been doing this full time for going on 2 years now, and I was doing a part-time newsletter before that while I was an attorney full time, and have loved getting to figure out and learn about all aspects of the industry as a journalist. But the reality is, like, more broadly, digital media is going through a rough time. Every day, at least towards the beginning of the year, I feel as though I was seeing headlines about BuzzFeed shutting down, Vice shutting down, whatever it is. And I feel as though we haven't seen any headlines like that in the watch industry or watch media industry, thank goodness. But the reality is it's tough. And a lot of the companies that sprouted up over the past 2 decades landed on this sort of model in which commerce subsidizes content, for better or worse. That obviously comes with all kinds of, potential, I don't want to call them issues, but it just comes with all kinds of different expectations, and you get pulled in all kinds of different directions, which is fine. You have to pay the bills somehow, but things are changing rapidly. And for me, someone who is like very interested in the media space, I worked for a college newspaper, wrote for a law review in law school and all these types of things, always loved media, but have always been concerned about making a career in it. It's a scary but exciting time, I would say, because of all of the things that we talked about. Things are changing rapidly. Things like generative AI are changing the way in which things are done. To get back to the quote that Wilhelm Schmidt said, anyone that drives value to the consumer will continue to have a business model. I think that's basically what you have to think about as a media person. And I'll be the first to admit that I don't get this right every time, nor does Hodinkee, but we're trying to figure it out. And the reality is, a lot of the low-hanging fruit that blogs made hay on for the past 15 years is just going to go away. Things like introducing watches, regurgitating press releases, stuff like that is going to be done by AI in 6 months, or it's going to be done by computer in 12 months. And you are really going to have to do some really good shit. Otherwise, you're going to be out of a job. And I think that's scary, but really exciting. And I also think the reality is that may not support the types of businesses that people have come to know over the past 15 years, the BuzzFeeds, the Vices, the whatever else's of the world. But I follow, we've talked about my newsletter a little bit, and that's how I got started. I follow a lot of independent creators and newsletters, and I podcasters as well. Individual people that have strong points of view and do strong journalism or have strong analysis that's interesting, and they have a strong POV and know what to expect. I think it's a really exciting opportunity for them as these other businesses that built their business in a different way kind of struggle through the current era.
Can I ask what I think is, look, it's a little bit of a rough question, but I really, really value your opinion, and I'd love to know. Hodinkee for many years was, I would say, the town square for watches. And I can say that factually, in the sense that when we would do a collaboration, if we got Hodinkee coverage for it, like, we saw the traffic impact of that, and we saw the implied conversion from that. When you think about 2025, 26, 27, what do you think the town square for watches looks like moving forward? And what is Hodinkee's role in that?
Yeah, so first of all, I still think Hodinkee is the name in watches. I think still people look to them for what's happening and what the culture is in the space more than any other media publication, if I should be so bold as to say. The reality, though, is that social media is where everyone goes. I mean, I open Instagram more than I'd like to admit. I'm sure you guys do as well. I'm not of the TikTok generation, but like people are, I think social media, this isn't just watches, this is everything. Social media is the town square, or whatever you want to call it. At the same time, I think people are tired of it. People are tired of seeing the same old shit on social media, the same old influencers that are doing the same old thing. And I think there's some exhaustion from that. And I think we've already seen, I don't know about you guys, but I see and I get more quality information from private Slacks, private WhatsApp groups and stuff like that. I'm in group chats with people like you, maybe. That's where I see a lot of good information being passed around, a lot of good opinions being held. That carries with it a lot of risk. Things are privately sort of traded. Information, watches, whatever it is sort of privately traded in these back channels, it feels like. Things are just more dispersed. You don't know where to go. Mm-hmm. And I do think this is what Hodinkee has done best historically, is they've taken information like that. In the old days, it was taking information that was hard to find on forums and publishing it and broadcasting it out for all to see and hear so that you could be more educated and informed about watches before you went and bought one. I think Hodinkee and other publications, other writers, whatever, still can have a role in doing that on a go-forward basis. The trick is being plugged in enough to figure out where to get that information from. It's never been easy, but it seems to me that it's getting even more difficult. But this is, any good sort of writer, journalist has to source things, know where to find information, whether it's people, sources, data, whatever. And I think that will continue to be like the role of a publication that wants to survive on, going forward.
Is there any advice that you would give to somebody starting a new outlet or approaching watch media from scratch right now?
It seems to be, first of all, for now, TikTok is the easiest way to find a bunch of people quickly. You just get so many chances to find people. But from there, you have to figure out. The reality is social media and influencing sounds exciting, but these influencers are not making a ton of money. Like, if you think digital media is hard, being an influencer is harder. There was a Wall Street Journal article recently about how most influencers are making less than $25,000 a year or whatever it is. It's not an actual business for most people, especially in watches that are just too small. But it's a great way to find people really quickly. But from there, you've got to figure it out. A real business that adds value to people, whether it's a newsletter, selling watches, being a vintage dealer, whatever. For me, it's always been just creating media and creating content. And I've sort of have believed in the newsletter format, as we've talked about, because of the way in which you can just have an authentic connection with readers outside of the algorithm, if you will. But from there, it's first of all, finding a niche, I think, that you feel as though you can add something to and add a unique point of view to, and then you can build it out from there. But for me, it was sort of having a unique POV on vintage watches is kind of where I started, and have built it out from there a little bit, if I may say. But you kind of have to figure out, maybe it's independent watchmaking, maybe it's, whatever it is. I mean, we talked about hearsay stuff about retailers and ADs for the past 45 minutes a lot. And I don't see a lot of good original reporting on that type of stuff. I think there are all these little niches that you could really conquer. Auctions, I find endlessly fascinating. I could go on, but all these little niches that you could really cover as a beat if you wanted, and then build your portfolio out from there. But it's not easy is the reality.
That's one of the things I think we've seen with Openwork. For a long time, Asher and I, we love watch podcasts. We listen to many, even Hodinkee Radio, Tony. And I think it must have been about a year or so ago, James Stacy was like, you guys should do a podcast. And Asher and I were
really? I don't know that.
Maybe he told it to me.
James for all this, yeah.
He used to blame for all this. And I was like, yeah, but we don't really have anything to say, or that we have nothing to add that isn't already out there. And when we stumbled upon the idea for Openwork, which was to do a podcast about inside the watch industry, how the watch industry actually works, what's happening behind the scenes, it was clear that was a beat that we could cover that wasn't already being done. And the response has been, frankly, kind of overwhelming. I think we tapped into a pent up demand that we didn't realize quite was there. We thought really we weren't sure the world needed another watch podcast. And when we took the gamble and we did it, we've just gotten such amazing feedback and way more listenership than we could have dreamed of. I do want to go back to one thing that Steven said, because everything you guys have been talking about, we've been talking about, is in this world where there's this vibe session or there's this malaise. What are the things we could all do, whether we're retailers or media or brands or whomever, to create a vibe that is thriving again, that is positive again, that is fun again? And I do think there's a role, just like there is a role for the brands within how retailers behave and impacting the way retailers behave. There is a role for the brands for media as well. One of the things when we talked to Steven about was this notion of a conflict of interest. I think there's a perception, right, that any media outlet that also sells watches has a conflict of interest and therefore cannot be reporting fairly and accurately. And, I think that skepticism is healthy and people should be skeptical in that way. What Steven brought up was really interesting. He was like, well, I guess that might be kind of true, but honestly, I've never encountered that, whether working at Hodinkee or Revolution. If there was a watch I wanted to cover or didn't want to cover, it really had nothing to do with whether the publication retailed that watch or not. What was more of a consideration, however, was access. And this notion that if a brand was covered in an unfavorable way, that brand or that person in the industry would therefore cut off access in the future, right? And watch journalism, a lot of journalism is access journalism. And so I think the responsibility that a brand has is recognizing that access is the currency of journalism and reporting and watch media. I think that brands have a responsibility not to be punitive, and they have a responsibility to recognize that if they want a thriving watch media, they're going to have to allow access, and they're not going to have to seek retribution. We worked on a project once, and this was shocking to me, where the PR representative from a brand literally tried to rewrite an article for a journalist. And I've never seen anything like that in my life. And we told that PR representative, and the journalist told that PR representative, I'm not doing that. You can't do that. But there was this impulse from the brand to literally take control and put words in the mouth of the journalist. And this all gets back to this notion of access. So I do think there's a call for brands here, which is if they want a thriving watch media, which is good for business, they need to be comfortable with letting go a little bit and giving watch media and watch journalists space to cover the industry.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, I suppose I agree with all that you said. I would also add that the onus falls on media personalities such as myself to not be so scared, number one, of brands. First of all, the question is access. Like, access to what? Cool trips? At the end of the day, who cares? It's not your life, So the question is access to what, first of all? And then I think the onus also falls on us to not just kind of, as I was saying at the beginning here, take a press release and then turn that into a story, but do the legwork to make it an actually interesting story and make it an actual editorial product. I don't want to call it laziness sometimes, but look, and I'm sure you guys too, I get a dozen press releases a day or something. And if I'm having an off day, it's easy enough to just say, all right, I'm not going to do the hard work of writing an actual story or doing the actual legwork to call people to do this or that. I'm just going to write up a press release. Like, I think it's on us to do the legwork, to go the extra mile, to spin actually cool stories out of something. If a brand is pitching you a story or pitching you a new watch, that shouldn't be the end of the idea. That should be the beginning of the seed of an idea, of telling it from a historical perspective, a technical perspective, making it a video that people would actually want to watch. It should be the beginning of a conversation and not the end of a 500-word intro story. And if that's what you need to be able to do if you're going to have a job in 5 years, to be honest with you.
Well, Tony, thank you so much. Speaking of which, we highly recommend that everyone listening follow your writing at Hodinkee.com, of course, Hodinkee Radio, wherever you get your podcasts, and Rescapement.com. So if you're not already subscribed to Tony's newsletter, which comes out semi-frequently, let's say on an ad hoc basis, you can subscribe at Rescapement.com. It's a great way to keep up with everything Tony is writing about, whether that's at Hodinkee or, of course, his own musings. And as we said at the top of the show, that was the whole impetus of this show, getting your newsletter in our inbox. So thank you. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being so honest. And thank you for all that you do to contribute to watch media and the watch community. This has been Openwork, a production of Collective Horology. You can follow us at collectivehorology.com, and you can follow our guest, Tony Traina, at Hodinkee, Hodinkee Radio, and Rescapement.com. To get in touch with your questions, your feedback, and your suggestions, we'd love those. Just email podcast@collectivehorology.com.